Oh, no, no, no. We weren't always as civilized as you see us here today in Carson Valley in Genoa. We were the Wild West. Remember, we were settled in 1851. We had our share of heroes and villains. If you want to know about our villains, I can tell you what my father and the original pioneers before him told him. You see, my father arrived in 1863, but we had some law problems and triumphs prior to that. One of the first was a man by the name of Lucky Bill Thorington. Now, he had a ranch just over the California state line in Fredericksburg, the little hamlet over there in Carson Valley. And he also had a home on the corner of Carson and Main, which was the home that I was born in, because my father eventually purchased that home from Lucky Bill's son in 1869. But Lucky Bill, let me tell you a little bit about him. He was somewhat of a Robin Hood character. He championed the poor and the underdog, and he was no friend of the wealthy and the rich. He was wealthy enough himself. He was very good at the game of thimble rig and other gambling games. So that is probably how he got his name. And he did run afoul of the Mormons here in Genoa. So they were no fan of his. And in the year of 1858, there was a friend of Lucky Bill's who came from Susanville who was running from the law, and he had been accused of killing a man and stealing a racehorse. And he told Lucky Bill that he was not guilty. Lucky Bill believed him and allowed him to stay with him. The law was on the man's tail and eventually traced him to Lucky Bill's home. They bought the racehorse and then arrested Lucky Bill for harboring a horse thief. Now, most of them were Mormon, and they knew that Lucky Bill had several friends in the town of Genoa, so they took him out to Clear Creek next to Carson, and they gave him a trial there in a barn at a ranch right there on Clear Creek, in Clear Creek Canyon. And it was said that Lucky Bill knew he was doomed because you could hear the gallows being built while the trial was on, and the jury was all Mormon. So Lucky Bill, being the brave, gallant man that he was, walked up the gallows steps, and it said that he removed his necktie, placed the noose around his own neck, and jumped off of the scaffold singing his favorite song, The Last Rose of Supper. Now, don't think that he was completely innocent, because he also had a way of gaining land that was not necessarily honest. Heinrich Friedrich Dangberg, H.F. Dangberg, came here in 1857, and he acquired what is now known as the Klauber Ranch. That was his first piece of property. He took care of the land, he homesteaded, and he went off to California to sell what he had raised and grown. When he arrived back, Lucky Bill Thorington was sitting on his steps, and he had a shotgun across his lap, and he had two of his henchmen at his side. And Lucky Bill said, "What are you going to do now, Deutschman?" What he did is he jumped H.F. Dangberg's claim. H.F. Dangberg acquired land honestly by bringing friends over to work the land, and then they would either turn the land over to him or buy it from him. And Lucky Bill was a claim jumper. So that's a little bit about that scoundrel. But that's the home that I was born in. It was a beautiful home, but we moved after the 1882 avalanche. Another desperado, that there was no good in that man. And this happened just a couple years before Mother and Father arrived in Genoa. Sam Brown, why, he was the terror of Nevada Territory. He stood about 6 foot tall. He was 200 pounds. He had flaming red hair and a flaming red beard. He wore a Bowie knife on one hip, and he wore a pistol on the other with 12 notches, one for every man he killed. By the time he was 6 years old, he had already spent time in the newly built San Quentin State Penitentiary. Now, it was said that when he was sober, he was dangerous, but when he was intoxicated, he was lethal. There's a story that doesn't sound like it's a true story, but it is. One time in Virginia City, he was so drunk, and he was playing Faro, the card game, that he was upset he was losing, and he jumped up on the table and carved the dealer's heart out with his bowie knife, and then crawled underneath the table to sleep off his drunkenness. There weren't enough law in Virginia City to control someone like him. Well, as my father was told, there was some incident that caused Sam Brown to be upset with Henry Van Sickle, who was a landowner here in the Genoa and Carson Valley area, very honest man, a blacksmith by trade. And Sam Brown was so upset with Henry Van Sickle that every time Sam Brown drank and got drunk, the more drunk he would get, the more he would swear that he was going to take care of Henry Van Sickle. Now, on Sam Brown's 30th birthday, July 7th of 1861, he was at the Ormsby House in Carson City drinking his birthday away. And he got it into his head that he would give himself a birthday gift by making Henry Van Sickle the 13th knot on his pistol. So he rode into Genoa and stopped at Henry Van Sickle's blacksmith shop right there on the southwest corner of Main Street and Nixon. Now, Henry wasn't there. He was at his ranch about a mile south of town. And they told him so. So Sam Brown rode down to Van Sickle's station, as Henry Van Sickle's ranch was called, and he knocked on the dining room door, and who answered but Henry Van Sickle, who knew not to mess with Sam Brown. So he said, "Sam, why don't you come in for something to eat?" And Sam Brown said, "I'm not here for something to eat. I'm here for you." He pulled out his pistol, pointed it at Henry, and fired a shot at him. Luckily he missed, and Henry dove behind the bar. Now, something snapped in Henry that night because he decided he wasn't going to stand to live in fear any longer. He grabbed his scatter gun, grabbed an extra round of shots, and got on his own horse and chased Sam Brown down the foothill road. Now, Sam Brown stopped at Mott's station and wasn't allowed in, so the next place he could go would be Lute Old's ranch. And by then, Sam Brown thought that he would lose sight of Henry Van Sickle, that Henry Van Sickle wouldn't be able to follow him. But Henry knew where Sam was going. That was the only place he could go. And Henry knew a shortcut, which he took and arrived at Lute Old's ranch just ahead of Sam Brown. He hid behind the barn door, and soon as he saw Sam Brown ride up on his distinctive gray mare, he stepped out, raised his shotgun, and said, "Now I've got you, you SOB," and fired his shot. Well, it was at such close range that it hit Sam Brown, killed him immediately. He dropped off of his horse, and his shirt was still on fire, Henry said. Now, of course, the law was the law, and Henry was arrested, and he came up before Judge Allen. And Judge Allen took one look at the charges and banged his gavel and said, "Case dismissed. Sam Brown met his end by divine intervention." Now, of course, Henry was charged only with paying for Sam's burial. He had to buy him a new suit and a headstone. But Sam Brown rests in the old Genoa Cemetery, now just on the corner of Nixon and Genoa Street. That was one man I wouldn't have wanted to meet myself, that's for sure. But we had heroes. I don't want you to think we were all lawless. One of the men that my father most admired and knew for a time was a man by the name of John A. Snowshoe Thompson. Now, Mr. Thompson came over to the United States from Norway, from the Telemark area, when he was about 10 years old. And he ended up traveling when he grew up. He came over way before the gold rush. But when he was old enough and he left his brothers and his mother, he traveled to the gold country in California thinking he would get rich. But like most people, he didn't. So he worked a little farm on Putaw Creek near Hangtown and was living a decent life. But the winter of 1856 was one of the worst still on record. And Genoa here was cut off from any communication. So the Sacramento Union placed an ad saying, "Genoa, Citizens cut off from the world. Anyone who can help, apply here. Now, Mr. Thompson thought about this, and he said, back when he was a little boy in Norway, his brother and father would travel on snow skates or snowshoes, and I believe now they're beginning to call them actually skis. But they would be able to travel on the snow in any weather, and he figured that he could do it too if he could make himself some skis. So he did, tried them out. They worked fine. He applied for the job. Now, most people thought he'd be lost and they'd never see him again, because it was going to take 3 days to get to Genoa, going up the grade. And so some citizen, perhaps sarcastically or hopefully, hollered out on the day that Snowshoe left Hangtown with a pack of mail and goods that weighed about 100 pounds. "Good luck, Snowshoe Thompson," and that's how he got his nickname. As I said, it took 3 days to get to Genoa, and everybody was happy to see him when he got here. It took about 2 days to get back to Placerville. But he was a legend because he spent 20 years in the worst of weather delivering mail between Placerville and Genoa in this same fashion. He was never lost. He never carried anything he didn't have to. He never carried a firearm. He was only scared once when he encountered a pack of wolves. He had nowhere else to go but to ski right through them. They didn't know what he was, so they howled. He skied through them, and they just looked after him as he went by. He rescued several men. He was never paid by the government, but he was paid individually by people who asked him to carry mail or to deliver something to a friend back and forth. He was a citizen of Genoa and Carson Valley for sure. He established a little ranch out in Diamond Valley, which is at the south end of Carson Valley, but he married a Genoa woman, our own Agnes Singleton, who was a citizen originally of England, and they had a son named Arthur. And he also did some mining up in Markleyville, above Markleyville. It wasn't Markleyville at the time, up in Silver Mountain City. He carried the first assay from the Comstock to have it found to be silver. He took to Sacramento. He developed several of the water systems that we still use to this day in the valley. He was quite an industrious, honest, upstanding, sober, intelligent man. He was everyone's friend. He was very dependable. And on a very sad day in 1876, it was May, he was working his ranch, and he wasn't feeling well. He was working behind his horse, and so he decided to get up on his horse and finish what he was doing. And then he went inside and wanted to take a nap before dinner, and he never left his bed again. He ended up lasting just a few more days, and then died of what at the time they thought was pneumonia. Just a few years later, we discovered the effects of what appendicitis had on a person, and so now we believe he had appendicitis. Unfortunately, he died a year before I was born, so I never met him, but Father was good friends with him. Father has fond memories of him and remembers the grand funeral that they gave him, using the courthouse as the place for the funeral. And now Mr. John Snowshoe Thompson is buried in our cemetery, right north of town, just about half a mile north of town. And it's heroes like that who've saved Genoa that kind of cancel out Mr. Sam Brown and Lucky Bill Thorrington. And when we talk about heroes, we can't forget to talk about the Pony Express. And one of the biggest heroes, the most well-known and famous of the Pony Express that ran only 18 months, 1860 to 1861, was Robert Pony Bob Haslam. And we were a swing station for him. And he would come through and he would stop at Mormon Station and get a fresh horse and pick up any extra mail that was going between stations. He had the longest ride of any rider. He rode 380 miles in one trip when another rider wouldn't go on because he was afraid of Indian attacks, and this was during the Pyramid Paiute uprising. And most riders would only ride 100 miles before changing riders. So he had the longest, riding from his home station at our Lake Tahoe Friday station all the way out to Smith's Creek and back to Tahoe in one ride. He also had the fastest ride in March of 1861, delivering President Lincoln's inaugural address. He rode 120 miles in 8 hours and 20 minutes, and that was the fastest ride of the Pony Express, which averaged 10 days for 2,000 miles. They did this entire ride in 17 days, in 7 days and 17 hours. So he was quite a hero to us, and we had a relief rider by the name of Theodore Perry Hawkins that would ride between Dayton and Lake Tahoe when necessary, and so he was part of the Pony Express as well, and he's on the records. So I wouldn't worry too much about our future. We're now a civilized town. That is how we were able to acquire and keep our statehood. But we had some exciting times, all before I was born in this case, but I just wanted to share a little bit of that with you. And you can walk around town and visit the same sites that all of these men, good or bad, had some influence in. So enjoy your tour of Carson Valley in Genoa, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate to come back and ask me about them. Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to speak with you.